This presentation is the very first in a series on the virtues, and that will be this particular section that we cover next. And so let's get started. Let's begin with a basic definition. What are we talking about? What is a virtue? According to the Catechism, the most basic definition of a virtue is a firm, habitual disposition to achieve our ultimate good. And in parentheses there you see that our ultimate good is God. That was a rather lengthy section that we had earlier this semester. So it's a firm habitual disposition to achieve the good, most especially our ultimate good, and our ultimate good is, of course, God. Just a couple of comments on some of these words. Habitual and firm, what do we mean by that? We mean lasting, solid, stable. The kind of idea that, once you learn to ride a bike, you kind of always know. Even if you go years without doing it, it's really hard to forget. It's that muscle memory. It's always there. That's where we get the expression, like riding a bike. Once you get back up on the seat, it just kind of comes naturally. And so once we have virtue, that's a whole nother discussion. But once we have virtue, it's habitual and firm. It's lasting. It's solid. It's stable. It kind of comes naturally, even though we may not have to specifically practice it or think about it. It just comes naturally, and it never goes away. So to speak. Disposition. What do we mean by disposition? We basically mean the capacity to do something, the power to do something, the ability to do something. Not necessarily that we're doing that thing at all times, but that once you have the ability to do something, then you hone the talent or the skills necessary to do it. You have that disposition. The greatest basketball players, the greatest baseball players, the greatest athletes in the world have honed their abilities to such an extent that they are among the few in the human population that can do certain things, but that's not all they do. They don't sit around doing that all day. And so you have that disposition, that power to do something when the time comes. And then finally, what makes virtue, kind of specifically virtue, is that it's always for the good. There's no such thing as a virtue that is done for something that is bad. That would be called a vice. There's a whole nother a word for that. So a vice would be a firm habitual disposition to not achieve our ultimate good, or to act maliciously, or to act without reference to good. But when it comes to virtue, virtue is specifically for the good. And we're talking about good actions here. Virtue is oriented to good actions. So, how many virtues are there? We've kind of defined virtue. How many fit that definition? Well, the answer is 7. There are faith, hope, charity, which we also call love, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. The divisions of the virtues. The virtue is split into 2 categories, what we call the theological virtues, and then also what we call the moral or the human or the cardinal virtues. So if you go and study ancient Greco-Roman philosophy and ethics, you will find 4 major virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. In Christian history, we add 3 theological virtues to make 7: faith, hope, and charity. We'll discuss those in a little more detail in the future. But let's look specifically at the theological virtues for now. What are they? Faith, hope, and charity. Charity, also love. I tend to, in Catholic theology, tends to favor the word charity because it's a little more, it identifies a bit more the Latin term caritas, and is not so misused. There are basically, when we use charity or love, there's the possibility that what we mean to say is lost. When we say love, the great threat is that we have overused this term in the English language. I love pizza, I love my pet, I love my mom, I love my wife, I love my brother, all of which are different types of love, and don't seem to pinpoint something that's, the same in every case. And we tend to overuse the term love for things that you can't truly love, like food and objects. And that's why Catholic theology has tended to go more away from that and try to get as close as possible to the Latin terminology used by the great theologians of the church, where they use the term caritas. But when we translate that into English as charity, we tend to default thinking charity is when we give money to an actual charity for the benefit of the underprivileged or the poor or the homeless or something like that. And that is a correct use of the word charity, but that doesn't get at the virtue of charity, which is essentially this profound love, which we will define in a moment. So these are the theological virtues as opposed to the moral or cardinal or human virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. So, what about the theological virtues? First of all, they come from God. That's why we call them theological. So, step back for a moment. The word theological does not mean that just pertaining to the study of theology. What we mean here is look at that prefix theo. Comes from the Greek word theos, which means God, and logical theology, the study of God. The theological virtues are theological because they come from God, they have their source in God, and they direct us to God. God gives us these virtues, and He gives us these virtues so that we can relate to Him. So they come from God as a gift, and they are gifts, essentially, that direct us to God, much like a parent might give their child a first cell phone. It's a gift from the parent, but why did that parent give that cell phone to that child? So that they can call their parent, and let them know where they are, so that they can facilitate that relationship. That's what the theological virtues are. They are gifts from God to facilitate our relationship with God. And virtues, the theological, the moral virtues, are all spiritual qualities of our soul, meaning it's not some physical ability, it's not some physical capacity. This is a spiritual capacity. This is something that resides in our soul. So when we talk about the virtues, we are talking about spiritual capacities within the human person. About the theological virtues, they can be acquired and they can be lost. How so? So you have sanctifying grace, which is given us in baptism. And with sanctifying grace is that grace which heals the human person, first of all, restoring our nature, our human nature, back to its full functionality. Remember, original sin had kind of three primary losses. It was the loss of supernatural grace, which relates us to God. It was the loss of our own natural abilities as well. And with sanctifying grace, there is a recuperation, a healing. And so one of the first things that is healed is our relationship with God. And that relationship, as we've just stated in the previous slides, is facilitated through the theological virtues. And so sanctifying grace is given to us at baptism, and with sanctifying grace comes the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, which facilitate our relationship with God. Now, we acquire them through baptism. We can actually lose the theological virtues. Anytime you commit a mortal sin, you lose the theological virtue of charity. Why? Because everything that we do, every action that we do should be done for love of God. That's how we were made. That was our destiny, right? So when we have sanctifying grace, our call to discipleship is to love God and to love neighbor. That's the new commandment. That's the great commandment. Anytime we do something that's a mortal sin, what we have done is we have rejected the love of God. We have chosen to love something else above God. And when we do that, we kill the life of charity within us. And so with mortal sin, the virtue of charity is lost. Now, if we lose the virtue of charity, we actually still retain the virtues of faith and hope. Those are only lost if we specifically sin against them. You sin against faith by disbelief. You sin against hope by despair or presumption, which we talked a little bit in the Ten Commandments. So only if you specifically sin against those do you lose them. But either way, all of the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, are restored with the sacrament of confession, because with confession, sanctifying grace is restored. Now let's look a little bit at the moral, the human, or the cardinal virtues. These virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. I'm not going to define each of these yet, just like I didn't define the theological virtues, because we're going to look at those in a little more detail in the future. But it's just important that you know right now that these virtues, these four of the seven, are the moral or cardinal or human virtues. Actually, there are two types of these particular virtues. And we distinguish them between infused and acquired. Infused here, think of the term infusion. You might infuse a solution with some other substance so that an external substance is given to a particular solution. And so it's kind of added in. That solution would not be able to acquire that substance otherwise. So what does that mean? It means that there are two different types of prudence, two different types of justice, two different types of fortitude, and two different types of temperance. Let's go through this a little bit. The infused moral virtues are essentially the acquired moral virtues that are animated by love. They're animated by charity. So the infused moral virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, they're acquired through baptism with sanctifying grace. These are the way in which we achieve our supernatural end, God in heaven. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's the infused moral virtues that allow us to commit every action in our life as an act of love, to do everything for love of God. When I wake up in the morning and brush my teeth, I can make it a loving act to God by maintaining my health, and I do it for love of Him. And so that's actually the difference between the infused and the acquired moral virtues. So let me give you an example. Someone who has temperance might diet. They might willfully deny themselves eating certain foods for the sake of health, for the sake of living reasonably, understanding that I'm not going to eat that food even though I want to, because I'm not really hungry. I just know I have this desire to eat it, but I'm not really hungry. I don't need it. And in fact, I'll feel much better in the long run if I don't eat that, rather than eat it now, be too full, I won't sleep well, I'll wake up groggy, and so I'm just going to live reasonably. That's acquired moral virtue. You can actually be a terrible person. Hitler can acquire the moral virtues. You can be a terrible person and actually acquire the moral virtue of temperance in how you eat, or not watching too much television, or something like that. It's basically to live reasonably. But it's a completely different thing to deny yourself food for the sake of God. Why would we do that? Fasting? We might deny ourselves food so that we can pray instead. We might deny ourselves food to remind us that we do not live ultimately on food, but we live on the Word of God, as Jesus tells us in the temptations in the desert. We might even do it as reparation, as a penance. We might go without a meal to basically say, I'm sorry, God, for the sin that I've committed, and I'm foregoing food right now, something so essential to my existence. I'm foregoing food out of love for you, as kind of a personal punishment, a personal penance for the sin that I've committed, to make amends. I doubt many priests would give that penance in confession, but it's something we can take on our own. And in doing so, I'm going beyond simply living reasonably by not eating too much food. I'm actually making it an act of love, an act of sacrifice. You see, living reasonably is something anyone can do, whether they're Christian or not, whether they're saved or not, whether they have the virtues of faith, hope, and charity or not. Because we can require that through repeated action. That's what the acquired moral virtues are. Anybody can acquire moral virtue simply by repeating a human action in differing circumstances to where it just becomes natural. I can diet so much that it just becomes natural and second nature that I just eat healthy and reasonably. Um, and the only time that that's lost is through disuse. I stop using the virtues that I've acquired, or I actually foster the opposing vice. I start eating more food than I need. And next thing you know, I'm not eating moderately. But the infused moral virtues are basically the same moral virtues that come with charity. It's like charity takes those virtues and lifts them to a higher spiritual plane where we are not just prudent for the sake of reason, we're prudent for love of God. We don't just act justly towards our fellow man, giving what is due to our fellow man because that's reasonable and that's what's due them, but we do it out of love for our brother, out of love for the brother who is created by the same God who created me. I don't just act courageously because that's noble or I will receive rewards or honor from it. I act courageously because it's the right thing to do. I act courageously because I love God and God wants justice from me, and so I act courageously for Him. So the infused moral virtues are kind of like a spiritual version of the acquired moral virtues that come with charity, which means they can be lost with charity. So when we commit mortal sin and lose charity, we actually lose the infused moral virtues. What that means is that when I try to fast, when I try to do something for love of God, I can't because I don't have charity within me. I don't have the infused moral virtues. I can only do things out of right reason, which is what the acquired moral virtues are. This may be a bit confusing now, and I understand that. We'll get to this in a bit more detail when we go over the moral virtues individually. But just some general notes on the virtues. First of all, virtues are oriented toward action. Anytime we're talking about virtues, a virtue is not just a disposition, it is a disposition to act. So the virtues find their flourishing, their flowering in human action. So every virtue is oriented towards an action. And actually, every human act, every good act requires all of the virtues. As we get into studying the virtues, we're going to have a tendency to think, well, I need to practice the virtue of justice, so I need to make sure that I repay all my debts or something. Well, okay, yeah, that is primarily justice in a sense, but in order to be just in that case, I need to be temperate in my spending so that I have enough money to be able to pay back. I also need to be courageous in understanding that I may have to admit that I've faulted or I've defaulted on a loan or I've acted unjustly to someone and admit that to them. And actually, doing all of that is prudent. What I mean to say is that every act, in order to be virtuous, calls upon all of the virtues. For an act to be good, an act must be prudent, just, courageous, and temperate. Right? You cannot have an act that's good, but only good prudently, otherwise it's unjust. That's not possible. If an act is unjust, it's also imprudent, and it's also intemperate. And it also flies in the face of courage, right? So for an act to be good, it actually requires all of the virtues. And if it fails at one of the virtues, then it fails at all of them. And so this is the unity of the life. And it is really going to inform a lot of some of the things we'll talk about in the future, because it helps us to understand how every act must be just. That means even the most private acts somehow have a relation to those around me. Even if it doesn't seemingly affect them, it could affect me, and how it affects me also affects other people. And so all of the virtues are required for all human actions. And remember, virtues are firm habitual dispositions, but it's not just a habit. It's not like me getting up in the morning and I automatically brush my teeth and wash my face, so on and so forth. I do those things because they are habits. They're ingrained. I do them without thinking. What makes something a virtue is that even though the situation or the scenario changes, even though there may be a completely different circumstance involved, I do the good willingly, joyfully, and easily. I have built up the virtue so that in every situation, no matter what the case, no matter who's involved, no matter what the circumstances, I act for the good, not just in this one routine, rote way. See, the difference between virtue and a habit is this: a virtue, you do easily, but you choose it. It's something you choose. A habit, you don't choose a habit. That's the thing about habits. That's why they're hard to break, because you don't think about them. And if you do, just think with me for a moment. If you do something habitually, sometimes that's not all that great. It's not all that good because you're not choosing to do anything good. And at the same time, if you do a sin habitually, it actually mitigates the sin. It actually mitigates your responsibility because it's a habit. You're not actually choosing to do it, whereas virtue requires a choice. It's something you will. Whereas habits, something that is just ingrained in you, not necessarily something you choose. And finally, by virtue, we actually merit eternal life through grace. What do I mean by that? Virtue is a grace of God. It's a gift of God. God gives us the virtues. He gives us the virtues so that we can live the life of discipleship that is required for salvation. Virtue is the way that we enter heaven because virtue is the way that we live the life that God has called us to live.